Welcome to Talking Absolute Worship. We're back again with Proper 17, and we have assembled a galaxy of talent to guide us through these readings. And where better to begin than with Henriette, who's going to reflect, along with the other readings, on some words from Deuteronomy, which might have a bearing on what... Henriette.
Thank you, Phil. I wasn't going to reflect on those words, but it did strike me that all these readings are very much about doing rather than, the good old Reformed belief that we are saved by faith alone and not by works. So I did look at the reading in Deuteronomy, but you know that little verse 2, which you undoubtedly are pointing to, you must neither add anything to what I command you, nor take away anything from it. And it did remind me of a book that I read written by Rachel Held Evans. I don't know if you know it. It's called A Year of Biblical Womanhood. I can recommend it. And she actually takes it to the task, how many of these commands we really do live out in our daily life, and how easy or impossible that is. But I actually thought I was going to focus on James and on Mark, and especially on the little part where it says be doers of the word and not merely hearers, and also on the way how James lifts out the power of the tongue and what we say has a profound impact on others and on the world and on the communities that we shape around us and on our own world, of course, that we live in. And to have a little bit of a look at that, and at the same time have a look at the idea that Mark brings out of it is not what we put into ourselves or, what comes from the outside or what is on the outside that defines us, but what defines us is what inside us and what is inside our hearts. And of course, that often comes out in what we say, and especially when we're angry and words roll out of our mouths that show others what is actually really going on in our hearts. And in verse 21 of Mark 7, it says, for it is from within, from the human heart, that evil intentions come. And then we have this whole list of stuff that is coming out of our hearts. But like all good Christians, we often put a lot of emphasis on like the big sexual sins and stuff like that. And we don't so much lift out envy and slander and pride and what we do when we say words to each other and about each other. So I thought maybe I would focus a little bit on that and talk about that with congregations, because I do sometimes feel that those kind of things have a great, not great as in, yeah, that's great, but have a big place in our communities of faith. And sometimes stuff gets absolutely destroyed because of what certain powerful voices say. So that's, the direction I was going into.
Yeah, I think the book of James does provoke extreme reactions, I think, sometimes in Christian theology, doesn't it? There is some theologians from the past who I think have pretty much dismissed James because it doesn't talk about Jesus in an overt way, or the cross or any of that stuff. So how does it earn its place in the New Testament? And sometimes I think people just skip over it and think, well, that's just, that's grade one. That's grade one faith. Let's move on to the higher things, which are about our beliefs and our doctrines and all that kind of stuff, which even though we might not say that out loud because it would sound odd to say that, we kind of carry it with us, don't we? And it is just about do-gooding, and Christianity is more than that. So let's just leave that on one side and we'll move on to Paul's letter to the Romans, which none of us can understand, but clearly seems more important. And we'll deal with that instead. And the congregation thinking, oh no, I quite like the idea of thinking about how I'm living my life. What am I doing? What are my actions about? Because that's how people express. That's how 90-odd% of people express their faith. Sorry, I'm going on a bit now, but the supposed opposition between works and faith, in inverted commas, I think perhaps misses the understanding of faith. That faith isn't about head belief, that faith is about a trusting relationship. To have faith in Jesus is about having a trusting relationship with him. And if that doesn't involve what is dismissively referred to as works, then James is saying, what else does it involve? And explain it to me. Yeah, Henriette.
Yeah, I was going to say that exactly, that James, of course, is not at all about just works, but that he is saying that if you just have the faith and you only hear what is being said and said, oh, say that's right, and walk away, then it is kind of a useless type of faith. But I do find it interesting that he especially is the one who talks so much about speech and about what comes out of our mouth. And it makes me giggle to realize that Martin Luther, he did not even recognize James as part of the canon. And I think if anyone, he could have bridled his tongue a little bit at times. So it is an interesting thing for me that he did not want to know about James at all. And yeah, I think maybe he did not quite get what James was about.
I found myself thinking about James this week and just playing around with the idea of what kind of community these alleged opposites create. And it seems to me that if you're creating a community around, for want of a better word, works or our actions, it's a very different looking community to one that you create around doctrines or lists of beliefs, if you take belief in that way. And the works based one has potential to bring you into contact with an awful lot more people who have a similar world-changing agenda that you might share. Whereas the faith, I think understood wrongly, faith version that's alleged to be an opposite, distances yourself from people and segregates you off in a way that a works-based understanding of the gospel doesn't. It leads you out to other people with common purpose. Yeah, Henriette.
I do think there is danger, though, that if you are a works oriented congregation, that there is a danger that people do not know how to put in words why they do what they do. And so there is always that need to remind people that they also need words to explain why they do what they do, because a whole lot of other people also do good in our societies, and often they are not Christians. And I do sometimes wonder, how do people get to know that what I do in my deeds is because of my love for God and because of God's love for me and for us? So I do believe that the more works oriented congregation needs to find a way of putting that into words and to have a message of words as well, in the same way, of course, as a more theologically and faith-based community needs to find a way to put it into action as well.
Yeah, I often think we're not that as far apart from other people who who act with justice as we sometimes think we are. I mean, because at root, the answer to that question is why? Because I'm human. And if pressed further, I'd say, well, this is how God has created us. This is what humans are. To be fully human is to act with justice and in peace. And other people might say, yeah, it's because I'm human. It's the right thing to do. It's not that different an answer, is it? But I think it's important to try and put it into words. You're dead right. And we are utterly bad at doing that, and often do more damage trying to put it into words, because the words we choose often make it sound like everybody else is doing it for selfish gain or or for idiotic reasons, and it therefore doesn't count. So I think it's quite difficult territory, but really important to try and find what those words would sound like in the 21st century, because we're certainly not alone in understanding that to be human is to act with justice and peace. But we do have a particular motivation. Robert, what direction were you taking these readings?
Similar. I was looking at James and Mark, and it seemed to me that it's. I'm trying to think of a way of saying this politely. And cut the crap. Stop talking about it. Get on and do it. And again, remembering so many people I've worked with in the past who will, what the term used to be, they talk a good job. But when it actually comes to doing it, they're not really up to much. And I think there's lots about us or how we're perceived outside as being a group of people who talk a good job. And that may relate to what Henrietta says, that when we do stuff, perhaps we're not. But then I agree with you, Phil. I was going to say perhaps we're not noisy enough about why we do it. I'm reminded of, related to that, sorry, I'm going off a bit, of going into schools, primary schools, which are not church schools, and the people are, on the odd occasion, I've been invited in and looking. I remember one particularly standing in the entrance and looking around, and they got all this stuff about how you should treat each other. And it began to make me think, well, perhaps in a way, Christianity's become endemic in a sort of sense, certainly at that age, because they're taught how to treat each other and how to look after it, but it's not given the name. And that's sort of what you're saying, isn't it? Every good work, you could argue, is done in God's name. But yeah, so it was about, I suppose I was thinking about the kind of people we all know who will spout off about religion and tell you all the wonderful things about religion, but then it doesn't reflect in the way they live their lives. And I was reminded of somebody years ago talking about the different types of religion. And they said that, I suppose, sort of the faithy one, the talk, tends to have God at the centre, and then there's a line around the outside. And if you're inside that line, i.e. you accept all of the laws, then you are a Christian. And if you're outside that line, you're not. And it's quite clear. It's nothing to do with action. It's about what you believe. And then another illustration where God's at the middle and there isn't a line. There are just things working the way towards God or working the way away. And that was by their actions. And I think it's to do with that. So I think, put your money where your mouth is. Get on and do it. Be it in whatever way you can. That's what I felt it was saying. Externally, and so I was just sitting there before. I was thinking it's that thing of also you can't tell a book by its cover. So people will dismiss people because they don't look right or they don't appear right. They don't say the same things. They don't know what's going on. you know, they don't know what they're doing. They don't know how they live their lives, but they will make judgments. So I got onto this thing about telling a book by its cover. And then you talked about people overlooking James. And it reminded me of those high-blown people who will talk about they like really deep preaching that's got some grit to it, not this milk, you know. And I can remember it, well, if you'd got the milk bit, if you got the basics, yeah, we could move on, but you haven't, have you? So we've got to stay at the basics till you get it, and then we can move on.
You're not having your steak until you've drunk your milk. Perfect. I don't know where I have a suspicion that James or Jimmy, as we all know him, would be horrified if he thought that his letter had sparked off this debate of faith versus works, because it's just so redundant. It's not what James is talking about. He's talking about the one flowing out of the other and the other flowing out of the one in both directions. That although his language, to be fair, you can see how it encourages this debate. Saying, "Well, those ones that faith is worthless, whereas this one's dazzlingly awesome." But I think he'd be horrified if he thought that that's how his letter was taken for the rest of time, as some kind of irritant in this struggle between faith and works, as if they're separate things to be opposed to one another, because they're absolutely not, are they? It's not. I don't think how the Christian church healthily sees those ideas. So I think there's plenty of mileage in that. And you've picked out some modern day expressions for the same thing. And it depends how daring you want it to be, really. We've heard empty words, haven't we? We're not short of empty words in all sorts of spheres of life. How long have we been listening to politicians telling us that now they're going to get a grip of mental health services? How long have we heard politicians telling us for decades now they're going to finally sort out the care sector? And at the time it's words, and it's cheap words, isn't it? And yet we accept them. Because we re-elect the same politicians who've been telling us for years, and the current ones are telling us that their reputation is built upon getting the job done. And I'm suspecting that in 3 or 4 years' time, some of the jobs won't have been done, but we will have been told that they have been done, or they're going to be done very shortly because there's a plan to do them, and yet more empty words will flow. Some political persuasions may now be leaving. I don't know. This applies to all governments in the UK, certainly across the last 50 years. So, Neil, you've kept your powder dry. Where might you be heading with these readings?
Yes, maybe because there isn't an awful lot of powder left. I was quite struck actually with Psalm 15 because it's a very short psalm, and one of the interesting things is usually in our worship we get chunks of psalms. We don't often get to have the whole of a psalm. So one of the things that struck me about Psalm 15 is that we get the whole thing. But the other thing that struck me about it was that it's quite a depressing psalm in a way, because Lord, who may dwell in your sanctuary, who may live in on your holy hill? So you're about to read something in the context of everyone who's come to worship, and then it says, he whose walk is blameless, and it goes on from there. And I think that's got an interesting I was like Henriette and like Robert, I think I was drawn to James and Mark, but I was wondering how might I get there? And it strikes me that Psalm 15 might be a way in, because Psalm 15 kind of sets up something that just looks staggeringly difficult, that actually you have to be blameless in order to be in the sanctuary. In order to get closer to God, you have to live this life that is blameless. And we know that we don't. And then I noticed that, of course, at the beginning of James, it says, every generous act of giving with every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights. And I guess for me, it's kind of started to open up a sermon that might be about, well, we know we're not blameless. I mean, we know the opposite. God is the one who's perfect and we're not. So what does it mean for imperfect people to find their way into God's heart? And that's where I think James and Mark take us, because they're written for ordinary people. I mean, they're written for people like us. They're written for the people who are sitting in church saying, well, if you've got to be blameless to come, then I shouldn't come. I think the saddest thing I've ever heard was the person who said to me, well, I'd quite like to come to church, but I know I'm not good enough. And I suspect most ministers from time to time have come across either people who've said that, or people whose kind of demeanor has suggested that they feel that. And we're all sitting in church feeling, well, I'm not worthy to be here. I mean, I'm not worthy to wear a dog collar. I'm, you know, who am I? Who am I? And that's where I think James then comes alive, because James is not saying you have to be perfect. I think James is saying you have to have a go. You have to try to take what you've been given and offer it back to God. And I mean, the danger of perpetually being someone who comes on tour and waves books around. So I'm really delighted that Henriette got in there first. So it shows that someone else is reading books. Yay! So the book I would wave around is this one. James K.A. Smith is fabulous. He's a philosopher and a theologian. He writes stuff that I don't understand, so I don't buy those books. But then he has a wonderful publisher who says, you know, there is actually in some of what you're saying something really quite good. But if you don't find a way to instead of using 3 volumes, you need to get it into one small book. And that's what he's done. I mean, it's a bit like Tom Wright and N.T. Wright. And this is You Are What You Love, but I love the subtitle is The Spiritual Power of Habit. And his whole argument is that being a Christian is being someone who along the way picks up some habits that help you stay Christian. And for him, the big habit is worship. So, and I think in James and in the Gospel from Mark and in what we hear Jesus saying, you know, there's something there about what are the habits that shape you. And it seems to me that could be a really creative thing to open up for a congregation, because I don't know, I mean, maybe people have had different experiences, but on the whole, my experiences have been that an awful lot of us spend quite a lot of the time wondering, how could I be better as a Christian? How could I pray better? How could I serve better? How could I get to the Bible better? And this might be one of those Sundays where we actually, and I'll come on to this when we do some of the stuff that isn't about preaching, you know, how might this be a Sunday in church where we allow ourselves some space to explore the how of being a Christian, which isn't about theory, but is about what we do and the habits that we have.
Well, considering you told us you had no powder, Neil, that's pretty cool. Thank you, Robert.
It's just, yeah, I don't want. I think the way I would always preach something like this is very much like that. That we're all trying to be better, and that I'd want to take from it. There are those who will always tell you you're not good enough, but what I read in this is, as long as you're trying your best,
Yeah.
God sees, and your best some days might be good, and your best other days might be rude. But as long as you're, it's about the direction of travel, isn't it? And I think that's interesting that the worship. I've always felt that the worship is what encourages you week by week to keep on that path.
Yeah, Henriette.
Yeah, I totally agree with what you're saying there, Robert. And for me, this phrase came up through these Bible readings of getting to the heart of the matter, you know, which is a different way of saying cutting the crap, basically. But it's that, isn't it? Getting to the heart of the matter. What, you know, are your intentions pure from your heart? Is that what you're trying to do? You can be as holy as can be on the outside and tell everybody else that actually they are nothing. But it is about the heart of the matter. How are you inside? How is your standing before God inside your heart, isn't it? That is what it comes down to for me in these readings.
I think what you're saying there, Neil, resonates quite a bit with where my thinking was going on this, and links quite well, I think, as you suggested, with the gospel, with the odd little chunks of Mark that the lectionary has stuck together in 3 pieces into one reading. But it seems to me that this whole incident here between the Pharisees and the scribes and Jesus is about those religious habits, or I think I nowadays try to use the word practices, although I know the book Holy Habits has achieved quite a lot of popularity. It's still quite a negative word in people's heads, and if you tell someone you're just doing that because it's a habit, it's difficult to get past the negative connotations that has. And if you describe going to worship as a habit, they say, well, that's not good enough because it's just a habit, and you could try to burst your way out of that, but why bother when there's other words? So, you know, practices also has its problems, doesn't it? But there you go. But this whole idea of the washing that the people of Israel had was a really important religious practice. They're not being idiots in asking Jesus about this. They're not being bad people by asking Jesus about this. They're just saying, hey, this is like really precious to us. This is a habit of ours. This is one of our practices. Why is it that you're not observing it? And I think that's really interesting. And what we could do with that is add it to the list of anti-Semitic diatribes of, you know, Pharisaism, you know, just thinking about rules, when I really don't think that's what's happening here. But I think Neil's suggesting a way through this that is quite positive in doing some work with a congregation to help us think through what are our practices. If it's not about washing our hands before we eat, although I still hope it is, particularly during COVID. If it's not about doing the washing up, washing of cups and pots and bronze kettles, which do go in microwaves, in the dishwashers, I understand. Then what are our practices? What are our distinctive practices? Because it seems to me it's difficult for Christians sometimes to pinpoint them, isn't it? And you could come up with a list about hospitality, about Sabbath. What are the practices that we keep about our prayer pattern? Is there a practice of prayer pattern that we have? And if so, are they important to us? And is Jesus going to challenge them like he's challenging these ones? And if so, why would he challenge them? And I think there's an awful lot of stuff in there that could be really fruitful for a congregation. with Deuteronomy, I stood back a bit from that and thought, wow, there's something here that's kind of so alien to the way we think now. Because the writer here says, who, when they hear all these statutes, will say, surely this great nation is a wise and discerning people. When the world hears about our lovely laws, they'll come flocking and think we're a great nation. We really don't think about laws in that way, do we, anymore? We really don't. What laws could a nation have that would make it look like an attractive nation that people would want to flock to? It's a very different direction to go in, but are the laws of our own nation the kind of laws that would make us an attractive nation that people would want to flock to? We've made a big song and dance about being able to set our own laws now. So in what direction should we be going now that we have gained ourselves this power to set our own laws? What kind of laws would invoke that kind of, when everybody sees who we are and our laws, then it makes us into a great nation. Fill in your own blank as to what those laws might be. Henriette.
Yeah, you really brought something up in my head there, Phil, with what you were saying about these laws, because I agree with you. I kind of thought, well, I'm not going into that direction, but the way you are wording it there actually made me have this thought of, but that is actually what has happened with our nations in this part of the world, because we do have people coming to flock to our nations because they think the streets are paved with gold. And that is because we were and we still are a welfare state where people look after you and look after each other. And so I am just wondering, now that you're saying it, I'm just wondering if that is something that could be lifted out of that passage, and to remind people of what a privilege it is to live in the UK and to have the possibility and the opportunity to embrace refugees and other people. Because essentially these laws that we have as a nation come from a Christian heritage. So you really sparked that off in my head as an idea, like, wow, this is an entirely new direction that you could actually take that text.
You could go further, couldn't you? And you could reflect upon laws that are currently coming up for debate, such as the police bill. And you could ask a congregation on which side they stand, picking up last week's theme, when it comes to these laws being debated, and whether that makes our nation more attractive or not, or more godlike or not, more biblical or not. Neil.
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating insight, and I think I'm so staying with that Deuteronomy text. What other nation is so great as to have their gods near them the way the Lord our God is near us? So people are looking, not just they're seeing these laws, but they're seeing the God who is represented in these laws. So yeah, it would be interesting, wouldn't it? That I mean, so much of what we hear as we listen to the stories of refugees and asylum seekers is, you were the city on the hill, you were the beacon, you were the place that of course we would come to, because you were the place of safety and security and goodness and all these things. And then we discover you're also a place of a hostile environment and appalling things. So there would be something very poignant about this. And of course, I mean, it would be interesting to stick with that Deuteronomy text and think, what would it be like for the people of Israel in exile in Babylon to say, well, hang on a minute. We're meant to be the nation that all the other nations look at and say, isn't their God close to them? And we're the nation who've been carried off into exile. So the church could also do with a bit of that thinking, because I suspect we would also, wouldn't we, say, so much of what is now, embedded in our culture, in our welfare state, in our education system, used to be the preserve of the church. I started off ministry in Halifax, where people happily told me that they had 700 children in the Sunday school. But they didn't have 700 children in the Sunday school learning to be devout followers of Jesus Christ. They had 700 children in the Sunday school learning to read and learning to do their sums, because there wasn't an education system around that could do that for them. So maybe in a sense, we in the church, to some extent, are also in exile. And we're seeing that other people have taken over a lot of what we did. So there would be an awful lot. I think what's great, Phil, is that what you've opened up is an entirely alternative set of sermons.
Yeah.
Pick one. Don't do them both.
I think that's the thing, isn't it?
Pick one. Yeah, but it's very much like what Robert was saying earlier on about going into the primary school and saying, "Hang on, this feels very Christian. This list here, but it's not given. It's not got the name."
You could almost argue we're victims of our own success. Which is a very alternative way of looking at us, isn't it?
Yeah.
If we're going to wave books around, Neil waved this one around a while ago, I believe. Sam Wells for Good. It's a pretty good book because look, it's. I always look at a book that way around, not this way around. It is as a first option, and I think that Sam Wells makes this point about the church mourning the stuff we used to do, and it's almost like, someone's taken over our schools, someone's taken education off us, someone's taken the health service off us, someone's taken food banks off us, we're holding on to those. That nobody's getting the food banks, but somebody's taken fair trade off us, and it's almost like we're always fighting the battle of 50 years ago, and failing to spot what spaces we should be moving into in the 21st century. What does that look like? What does the Sunday school of Neil's Halifax 300 years ago look like in the 21st century? Something very different, I imagine. Yeah, Robert.
Well, just thinking that the Holy Spirit's moving forward and wants us to follow, and if we're still focusing on the things of 50 years ago, we're not seeing it. It reminds me too of a conversation I had about 15 years ago with an American guy who'd come over for a funeral, and he was telling me what was wrong with this country, and it was that the church had allowed the state to take over all of it. So that's why the church was dying. It was his point. And maybe it's not that it's that we just need to work out what it is we're to be doing now instead of looking back. But that's really, The
other difficulty with this Deuteronomy passage and law and this whole subject is that the writer of Deuteronomy is coming from the position of a theocracy, and the world isn't currently that well disposed towards theocracies, because they think, Muslim laws. What we want is a secular society, and how that works with laws is a very different kind of understanding. Yeah, Neil.
That's right, and I think that's maybe where James then becomes all the more significant, because what James is then doing is saying, well, wherever you are, what is the thing that you can do, and it may be that you just shut up. And it may be you hold your tongue. It may be you don't just launch in. It may be you become a really good listener. There's lovely stories, aren't there, of churches that have said, yeah, we've lost a lot of our power, actually. We've set up some benches and we just sit and listen to people, and we don't try to give them all the answers, because we haven't got any really. What we have got is companionship and friendship, and we can do that. So there might be all sorts of ways, in which Sam Wells and others are pointing us to say, in a sense, we should be celebrating the fact that we live in a nation that has said, that stuff the church banged on about things like universal health care, access to education. Let's do those well. I mean, we don't do them as well as we should, but we do them better than plenty of other places. So what then is the point of the church? Is a good question, and maybe a really fruitful question to explore on this Sunday.
Robert?
It just reminds me of something. I did a hospital chaplaincy course years ago, and I remember in discussion people saying, well, I go and sit next to somebody and I just feel useless because I can't do anything. And the whole point was that there's an arrogance, one, in feeling you can resolve people's problems, but the fact not doing anything doesn't mean you're useless. It's about being there with them, sitting alongside them, which is exactly what Neil's saying. So is that we're looking back, holding on to power, and influence we had, when we need to learn something about just being and being part of society and being available to people when they need us. It's just that people don't realise that that's the issue, isn't it? That it's how do you get people to understand that we have something to offer when they need, that our just being is important.
Yeah, another book I've read recently. That's a good one. See, Michael Forster, Being There.
Oh yeah.
Healing Power of Presence. Absolutely fabulous little book, ostensibly about pastoral care and drawing lessons from Carl Rogers' psychology, school of psychology, whatever you'd call it. But he opens with he tells the story much better than I will. But he opens with a scene from some kind of residential facility for people with mental health issues, and an interview with a patient who is telling the interviewer how much his life has been changed since talking with Edgar, and how he's over several weeks been talking with Edgar, and how his whole perspective on life has changed. And so Michael tells the story much better, and I'm fairly sure it's a true story. It's only after some time that the interviewer realizes that Edgar isn't a person at all. Edgar is the ward rabbit, who sits in a pen on the ward, and the patient climbs into the pen and sits and just talks, and Edgar listens, or rather Edgar doesn't respond, doesn't try and fix his problems, doesn't make any suggestions, doesn't chip in with something similar happened to me, doesn't chip in with advice. Edgar just occasionally turns off and goes and gets a carrot, but is there, just being there. And Edgar is healed, or part of the guy's healing process is by talking to the rabbit. And it's obviously there's more to the book than that. He says we are more than rabbits. There is more to us than that, and we have more to offer. But that's the starting point, and I think that's really quite powerful, about who we can be and what we can practice and what we can offer. Quite what that has to do with government, I don't know, but there you go. Talking about listening and benches and sitting on benches and offering people the opportunity to talk, and the space where life has maybe left them behind, and the world isn't interested, and the world doesn't give them any space. Yes, Robert.
Well, it says something to government in that it says that we are our population is more than just economic units. You know, we're not just here to produce and grow the economy. There's more to life than that.
Yeah, right on, brother. Right on. Come the revolution. Okay, so that's the sermon sorted. A couple of directions you could go in. Hopefully you'll find something there that will set you off. But there's other stuff to do in worship. Otherwise, we wouldn't be there for the full hour. So, Henriette, what ideas have you come up with?
Well, you have kind of changed the complete direction of my sermon now. So I was thinking to stay with Deuteronomy, and it would be quite good fun to, in the weeks leading up to this Sunday, to gather together quite controversial newspaper articles, and to then give them out to people and say, what kind of Christian laws could you see at the base of this? So I don't know, you know, some kind of newspaper clipping about immigrants coming in or something, and to just see, okay, what Christian law is at the foundation of this. So that could be quite good fun. But I had thought of, if we are talking about, if I was going to take it into the direction of bridling our tongue. I've done this before with a different congregation, asking people if they agree with the saying, sticks and stones can break my bones, but words will never hurt me. And it actually took me by surprise that time, how much stuff was coming up in people. And they all start to share that, you know, basically the worst thing that they can remember ever happened to them is something that someone ever said to them. And it is quite a powerful illustration to show people how much words actually hurt us and have an impact on us, on our lives. And I found a really nice version of Psalm 15 done by the sons of Korah. Well, why are you, Robert? So I'll go and try and share that again. And they basically just sing the words of the psalm.
Who may dwell in your sanctuary? Who may live on your holy hill? Who may dwell in your sanctuary? Who may live on your holy hill? Only he whose walk is blameless, only he who does what is righteous, only he who speaks the truth from his heart, only he.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Robert, what have you come up with?
I found Psalm 15 sung by somebody called My Soul Among Lions, and I actually contacted them last night because this is what Susan Derber does, and asked if I could use it, and they said, yeah, fine, go ahead. So let's see if I can share my screen with you.
Cody from My Soul Among Lions. Welcome to my living room. I'm here with my friends Corey and Cole. Today we're going to sing for you a new version of Psalm 15 called Your Holy Hill. Hope you enjoy.
Oh
stop screen share?
Red button at the top that says stop
Oh,
sharing.
yeah. Right, there was that, which I think was much better than the other one. And then I found a thing where it suggested that you did Psalm 15 as a sort of call and response to the congregation, as a call to worship, and then used it as a responsive prayer of confession. So we want to obey you in everything and always do what is right, but we often obey our own wants and wishes instead, and so on like that, which I thought was quite interesting. So those were the two things. The other thing, but this was more about when I say don't, you can't tell people by what they say. There's a song by somebody called Bo Diddley called "You Can't Judge a Book by the Cover," which I thought might be quite interesting to. Do you want to have a look at that?
No service of worship could ever be made worse by including some Bo Diddley.
Hang on. Yeah, share sound, share. Here we go.
You can't judge apple by looking at a tree. You can't judge honey by looking at the bee. You can't judge a daughter by looking at the mother. You can't judge a book by looking at the cover. Oh, can't you see? Oh, you misjudged me.
Yay!
Oh,
I
I
love
thought
that.
might be interesting. Yeah,
Absolute legend, Bo Diddley. Yes, that's certainly in. Yeah, that's a winner.
Okay, so those are my thoughts.
Neil, obviously alongside Bo Diddley, everything will pale into grey soup. But what have you got in your Tucker box?
Yeah, so indeed, we're heading into grey suit territory. So let me just share sound and do all of that. Okay. Hopefully you've got that. So one of the things I thought about, if you're pursuing this idea that this is a time of worship where maybe we would actually explore some of the habits and things, this is a video about doing the daily examine.
And rest your mind. Take a deep breath in and hold. Exhale slowly. Take another deep breath in and hold.
And more of the same. I mean, there are lots of those out there, but it did strike me that might be something to play around with. Just, something that's about a daily practice that might help. And then the other one, so I'm going to share again, that I came up with. I mean, these are not hugely inventive, but just to think about, the significance of the labyrinth and the finger labyrinth. And I mean, this would certainly be the sort of thing where everyone in the congregation could be given on a piece of paper, they could be given a finger labyrinth, and you could just really, as for the prayers, in your prayers of thanksgiving, one of the ways of doing a finger labyrinth or walking a labyrinth is that as you go into the center, you kind of think of the things you want to let go of, the things you want to lay down. And then as you come out of the center, you think of the blessings and the gifts that God is giving you that you might want to travel with. If you were doing that in worship, I think you would probably have to use a fairly simple labyrinth rather than the complicated Chartres labyrinth that would take some people, if you do it properly, you know, you'd have some people still there at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, which wouldn't be a bad thing. And I mean, if you really wanted to go for it, of course, would be to create a labyrinth. And actually, when you come to church, laid out on the floor or somewhere, have a labyrinth. So this might be this might be a Sunday to explore a little bit more about the significance of labyrinths. But it's interesting that, you know, mindfulness. I mean, we've talked already a lot about kind of how church stuff has kind of translated into the law, but also into popular culture.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of kind of Ignatian and Benedictine spirituality has found its way into popular culture, not least with some of the things that you can read and see about mindfulness. So it might be interesting in worship to actually say, let's recover some of the Christian worship traditions that actually are absolutely about being mindful, taking time.
Yeah, mindfulness is basically Ignatian spirituality with all the good bits stripped out. It's an empty version of Ignatian spirituality, he said uncontroversially, but it has been shamelessly stolen. I've got on my my phone 3 apps that do daily examens, and it's as even in our congregations, many people will own something that's known as a mobile phone, and having it as an app on your phone where somebody will read the daily examen for you, it's just an easy way of getting into it, an easy way of doing it. And some of them will actually pop up a reminder to remind you to do it too. So I've got the pray as you go one, which was as an older one, and that's the Jesuit community does that. I've got Lectio 365, which is the 24/7 Pete Gregg prayer movement version of it, but they've basically stolen the idea and done it in a slightly different language and slightly different style, but very, very similar. It's the old examen. And then there's something called Reimagining the Examen, which has lots of versions of it that you can just pick one and it will do it for you, or you can read it for yourself, or it will read it for you, and it's all there. I think there's just lots of richness in exploring our practices and thinking it through. One of the things, as I'm moving house and will be changing my pattern of life, particularly around which day off to have, which sounds like a small thing, but actually it's quite a big shift. And it's an opportunity to reorganize how my life works a bit. And because I'm shifting from having Friday off to having Monday off, it's quite a big like refocus of how my week works. But I'm quite conscious that Monday follows Sunday. And Jewish tradition is to have Shabbat, isn't it? Which is to have a meal before Sabbath to mark the beginning of Sabbath. And I thought, if I'm going to choose Monday as Sabbath, and how do I incorporate that as a practice, as something purposeful? And I discovered in the Northumbrian Celtic daily prayer liturgies that they have, there's 2 of these books. This is book 2, and I think book 2 is the one that has this in. They have a liturgy for dedicating, well, they call it Shabbat, for dedicating a Christian celebration of the Sabbath, and you have a meal, and there are some words that go with having that meal, and you do it deliberately on purpose on the eve of Sabbath, so then you have that as your practice. And it's something that we're thinking about. When you make a new start and you make a move, you can then stick new stuff into your life, can't you? Because suddenly there's a bit of space and room for maneuver. So I think there's huge mileage in that, Neil, and that would be one direction I think the whole service could go in. As I think we were saying earlier on. I've not much more to add, other than to think about this tent stuff in Psalm 15, and Neil described for us very well how depressing that could be if you were to ask that question. I kind of wondered about either setting up a tent. If you've got kids present, an all agey type service, you could some pop-up tents are quite easy to make quite quickly. You could set up a tent and you say, look, hey kids, here's a tent, isn't this exciting? Who wants to go in the tent? And a load of kids put their hands up and they all come out and say, hang on, there's just a few rules first. And then you go through a sort of psalm-like list of who's allowed to go in the tent, and it turns out none of them are allowed in. Or you could do it with the whole congregation. You could set a gazebo up by the front door, couldn't you? One of those pop-up gazebos, quite easy to do. So it looks like there's a tent and you're going through a tent to get into church. And you could say, everyone welcome, and have an elder outside welcoming everyone. And then say, but just before you go in, just to check. And you could check off this list from Psalm, and it turns out no one's allowed in at all. And then you could pose, so what are we going to do about this? God says no one's allowed on this holy hill or in his tent. None of us are allowed in. What do we do about this? And then you come up with some answer, which I'm not going to give you because I don't know. Neil came up with an answer earlier on, didn't he? It was all to do with James. So there we are. Scroll back, rewind, find out what the answer was from James that Neil offered us earlier on. So you could do some tent stuff. There's some fairly obvious music choices that come from the beginning of James. But they tend to be harvest hymns. All good gifts around us are sent from heaven above. That's the beginning of James. That's that first thing that Neil picked out. Every generous act of giving with every perfect gift is from above. So you could use the chorus from We Plough the Fields and Scatter as a prayer response, and they could all sing, all good gifts around us are sent from heaven above, then praise the Lord. It doesn't have to be harvest to sing that, does it? In fact, it's quite interesting to do that sometimes. And then there's a great is thy faithfulness, takes that word too. You have to sing it through for yourself until you stumble across that line, because I can't remember exactly how that goes now, but it is in there. And then there's John Rutter's Look at the World, which I think is a bit twee, but people love it. Every good gift comes from God above. So if you wanted to play something nice and a little bit twee that a lot of people love, then you can always stick your John Rutter in there to get everyone back on side after you didn't allow them in the church to start with. Maybe. So a wealth of stuff to think about as you prepare worship for this coming Sunday, or if you're preparing in advance, maybe in several weeks' time, who knows? For most of you, I suspect it's probably tomorrow, and you've turned to Talking Absolute Worship in desperation, looking for an idea to base your sermon on tomorrow morning. Either way, we hope that you have found something in the ideas and thoughts that we've shared that will inspire you to bring these words alive for your congregation. And as we dedicate you to that task, Robert's writing one now. Robert is going to pray with us. Thank you, Robert.
Let's pray together. So, loving God, we thank you for your word, the insights and thoughts we have shared today, for new ideas that bubble up when we think and talk together. We thank you that you gave us your law, and that you call us to be human beings and not just human doings. Help us as we prepare to be inspired, to be creative. And we pray that in all we do and say may be intended to focus the hearts and the minds of those who worship with us on you and on your Son, Jesus. This we ask in his name. Amen.